October 14th, 1963. 3:47 p.m. A cramped secretary's office on the third floor of the United States Embassy in Moscow, where the radiators clanked and the windows overlooked Tchaikovsky Street. Martha Dodd Peterson sat at her Underwood typewriter, fingers steady on the keys, transcribing a cable about grain shipments, while a man she'd known for 6 years, a man whose real name she would never learn, stood 3 feet behind her, photographing classified documents with a Minox camera no larger than a cigarette lighter. The shutter clicked in rhythm with the radiator's hiss. She did not turn around. She had learned not to turn around. What made this moment extraordinary was not the espionage itself, which had become as routine as her morning coffee, but the fact that 2 floors below, in the embassy's security wing, a Marine guard named Thomas Rea was beginning to suspect that the secretary who smiled at him every morning, who baked cookies for the staff, who had worked at State for 11 years without incident, was the linchpin of one of the most damaging penetrations of American diplomatic infrastructure in the Cold War. He was right, and by the time anyone believed him, it would be too late. To understand how an American woman with a top-secret clearance became an active Soviet intelligence asset while working inside a U.S. embassy, not as a blackmailed victim or ideological zealot, but as a willing, methodical collaborator who evaded detection for over half a decade, you have to go back to 1957, to a different kind of Cold War vulnerability than the ones mapped in counterintelligence manuals. The Eisenhower administration had spent years hardening embassies against technical penetration, sweeping for bugs, rotating cipher clerks, implementing 2-person rules for classified materials. What they had not accounted for was the secretary, not the ambassador's secretary, who faced scrutiny, but the mid-level administrative assistant who processed cables, maintained files, knew the rhythms of the building, and was so thoroughly ordinary that she became invisible. Martha Peterson was 41 when she was recruited. She had worked for the State Department since 1952, first in Washington, then in minor postings, Bonn, Vienna, before Moscow. She was competent, pleasant, unremarkable. She lived alone. She attended embassy functions, but left early. She had no known romantic entanglements, no debts, no scandals. Her personnel file, reviewed in 1962 during a routine security update, contained a single notation: reliable, exceeds expectations in administrative tasks, suitable for continued service. The file did not mention that she had been meeting a Soviet handler in Gorky Park every 3rd Sunday for 5 years. The Cold War espionage apparatus, by 1963, had evolved into a bureaucratic ecosystem as complex as the governments it sought to penetrate. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, operated with industrial precision. Talent spotters identified vulnerabilities, handlers cultivated assets, technical officers provided equipment, and analysts processed the take. The CIA and FBI, meanwhile, had developed elaborate counterintelligence protocols, background checks, polygraphs, surveillance of foreign nationals, analysis of travel patterns. But these systems shared a fatal assumption: that espionage required coercion, ideology, or financial desperation. They were not designed to detect someone who spied because she wanted to matter. Martha Peterson's recruitment, reconstructed years later from KGB defector testimony and her own partial confession, began not with a pitch, but with a friendship. In the spring of 1958, she met a man at a diplomatic reception who introduced himself as Alexei Kulikov, a mid-level Soviet cultural attaché. He was charming, educated, fluent in English. They discussed Tolstoy. He asked her opinion on American poetry. Over the following months, They encountered each other at museums, concerts, parks. He never asked about her work. He asked about her life. He listened. He remembered details. By the time he suggested she might help him understand American perspectives on disarmament, just informal conversations, nothing official, she had already crossed a psychological threshold she didn't recognize. She trusted him more than she trusted her colleagues. The operational tradecraft that followed was textbook KGB methodology, adapted for a low-risk, high-value asset. Kulikov, almost certainly a cover name for a First Directorate case officer, never rushed. He spent 18 months building rapport before the first request for information, and even then, it was framed as reciprocal dialogue. If you could share your thoughts on how the embassy views Khrushchev's latest speech, it would help me advise my superiors on cultural exchange opportunities. She provided an unclassified assessment. He thanked her. A month later, he asked for a copy of a public embassy bulletin. She provided it. The requests escalated with glacial patience. A draft of a speech before it was delivered, a list of attendees at a restricted briefing, a cable summary that was classified confidential but seemed harmless. Each step was small enough to rationalize, large enough to deepen complicity. By 1960, she was photographing top-secret documents in her apartment and passing undeveloped film in a hollowed-out book during their park meetings. The KGB had engineered a perfect spiral. Each act of cooperation made the next easier to justify and the cost of refusal catastrophic. If she stopped, she would have to confess, and confession meant prison. What made Peterson uniquely valuable was not the sensitivity of individual documents, though some were highly classified, but her position within the embassy's information architecture. As a senior secretary in the political section, she had access to 3 overlapping streams of intelligence: outgoing cables from the ITO ambassador to Washington, incoming policy guidance from state, and internal memos discussing Soviet leadership dynamics and U.S. negotiating positions. She did not need to steal war plans. She provided context. The KGB's analysts could cross-reference her materials with signals intelligence, human sources in Washington, and their own observations to build a composite picture of American strategy. A single cable about grain negotiations, for instance, revealed not just economic policy, but the State Department's assessment of Soviet agricultural failures and the political calculus behind offering aid. A memo discussing Khrushchev's behavior at a recent meeting exposed American psychological profiling methods. Peterson was not a spy who delivered secrets. She was a spy who delivered understanding, and she did it from inside the machine. With a top-secret clearance and a desk 30 feet from the ambassador's office. The mechanics of her espionage were strikingly low-tech, a deliberate choice that reduced the risk of technical detection. She did not use radio transmitters, invisible ink, or coded messages, all of which could be intercepted or discovered during a security sweep. Instead, she relied on physical media and personal meetings. Her Minox camera, provided by Kulikov in 1959, was hidden in a false-bottomed cosmetics case in her apartment. She photographed documents at night, after returning from the embassy with materials she had signed out under the pretext of working late. The embassy's document control system, designed to prevent wholesale theft, was not designed to prevent a trusted secretary from taking home a few files overnight. She would return them the next morning, logged and intact, while the film went into a dead drop, a hollowed-out brick in a park wall, a magnetized container under a bench, where a KGB officer retrieved it within hours. The system was elegant because it was boring. No one suspected the woman who worked late because she seemed dedicated. No one questioned the secretary who took files home because she had done it for years without incident. The security apparatus was designed to catch anomalies. Martha Peterson had made herself the norm. But by late 1962, the norm was beginning to fracture. The first indication came not from counterintelligence but from a personnel complaint. A junior officer in the embassy's economic section, frustrated by delays in receiving files, mentioned to a colleague that Peterson seemed to be holding on to documents longer than necessary. The colleague dismissed it. Peterson was meticulous, probably just backlogged. But the comment reached Thomas Rhea, a Marine security guard who had recently completed an FBI counterintelligence briefing in Washington. Rhea had been taught to notice patterns, and he had noticed one. Peterson often worked late on Thursdays, the same night that a known KGB surveillance team was observed loitering near the embassy. It was circumstantial, possibly coincidental. But Rhea began keeping informal notes. He observed that Peterson's late nights correlated with an increase in document sign-outs. He noticed that she occasionally left the embassy carrying a large handbag, even though she usually carried a small purse. He saw her once, in Gorky Park on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on a bench near a man in a dark coat. She was reading. The man was reading. They did not speak. Rhea could not prove anything. But he filed a memo with the regional security officer in January 1963, recommending increased monitoring of Peterson's document access. The RSO, overwhelmed with reports of technical surveillance and Soviet harassment of embassy staff, filed the memo and did nothing. The decision to do nothing would haunt the State Department's Office of Security for decades. In the spring of 1963, the CIA's Moscow station received a tip from a walk-in source, a low-level Soviet official seeking asylum, who mentioned that the KGB had a highly placed source inside the U.S. Embassy. The source did not know the name, only that the asset was female, had been active for years, and was considered so valuable that her handler reported directly to the First Chief Directorate's leadership. The CIA shared the tip with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, which shared it with State's Bureau of Diplomatic Security. A review of personnel files identified 11 women with top-secret clearances working in the Moscow embassy. Martha Peterson was on the list, but she was not at the top. The top suspects were women with access to cipher materials, women with known financial problems, women who had been observed in contact with Soviet nationals. Peterson, by contrast, had a spotless record, no known vulnerabilities, and limited social contact with Soviets beyond official functions. The investigators decided to focus on the higher-risk profiles first. It was a rational decision based on incomplete information. It was also wrong. What the investigators did not know, what they could not have known without access to KGB operational files, was that Peterson's handler had been recalled to Moscow in early 1963 and replaced with a less experienced officer who made a critical error. The new handler, eager to prove himself, accelerated the meeting schedule and began requesting more sensitive materials. Peterson, who had survived for 5 years by maintaining strict operational discipline, pushed back. She argued that increased activity would draw attention. The handler insisted. In June 1963, she photographed a top-secret cable discussing U.S. contingency plans in the event of a Soviet move against Berlin. It was the most sensitive document she had ever handled, and she knew it. She also knew that signing it out would be noticed. She took it anyway, photographed it in her apartment, and returned it the next morning. The sign-out log showed her name. A week later, a security officer conducting a routine audit of classified materials noticed that the Berlin cable had been accessed by someone outside the normal distribution list. He flagged it. The flag sat in a pending file for 2 months. By August 1963, three separate threads were converging: RIA's surveillance observations, the CIA's walk-in tip, and the audit flag. None of them, individually, constituted proof. Together, they formed a pattern. On August 19th, the regional security officer authorized a discreet investigation of Peterson's activities. Her apartment was placed under intermittent surveillance. Her document sign-outs were reviewed. Her financial records were subpoenaed. The investigation proceeded slowly, carefully, because the consequences of a false accusation against a career State Department employee were severe. But the consequences of allowing a spy to continue operating were worse. On September 12th, FBI surveillance teams observed Peterson entering Gorky Park and sitting on a bench near a man later identified as a known KGB officer. She placed a book on the bench. She left. The man picked up the book. Inside was a roll of undeveloped film. The FBI had its proof. The question now was whether to arrest her immediately or allow her to continue operating under controlled conditions to identify her full network. The decision was made in Washington. Arrest her. The risk of further compromise outweighed the intelligence value of a controlled operation. October 14th, 1963. 6:23 p.m. Martha Peterson was arrested in her apartment by FBI agents flown in from Washington and Russian-speaking State Department security officers. She was read her rights in English. She said nothing. A search of her apartment uncovered the Minox camera, 3 rolls of undeveloped film, a one-time pad for encoding messages, and a stack of classified documents she had signed out that afternoon. She was escorted to a secure room in the embassy and interrogated for 11 hours. She did not deny the espionage. She did not explain it. When asked why she had done it, she said, "Because someone finally thought I was important." It was the only moment of emotional candor in the entire debriefing. The rest was procedural, confirming dates, identifying documents, describing her handler's appearance. She refused to speculate on what the Soviets had done with the information. She refused to express remorse. She signed a confession on October 15th at 4:17 a.m., and by noon she was on a military transport to Washington, where she would face charges under the Espionage Act of 1917. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and opaque. Peterson was arraigned in federal court in November 1963, charged with conspiracy to commit espionage and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Her attorney, a public defender with no experience in espionage cases, advised her to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. She refused. She insisted on a trial. The trial, held in a secure courtroom with limited public access, lasted 4 days. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the surveillance logs, the confession. The defense argued that Peterson had been manipulated by a sophisticated intelligence service, that she had not intended to harm the United States, that her actions were the result of loneliness and psychological vulnerability. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found her guilty on all counts. On December 18, 1963, she was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted that her betrayal was all the more grievous because it was voluntary, calculated, and sustained over years. She showed no reaction. She was 47 years old. Peterson served 19 years of her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia, the same facility that had housed Axis Sally and would later house Martha Stewart. She was a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, solitary. She worked in the prison library. She attended no programs. She received no visitors. In 1982, after multiple parole denials, she was released on the condition that she never discuss her espionage activities publicly and that she submit to periodic FBI interviews. She moved to a small town in rural Pennsylvania, where she lived under her maiden name and worked as a clerk in a hardware store. She died in 1991 of lung cancer. Her obituary, published in the local newspaper, made no mention of her past. It described her as a quiet woman who kept to herself. The damage assessment conducted by the CIA and State Department in the months following Peterson's arrest revealed the scale of her betrayal. Over a 5-year period, she had provided the KGB with an estimated 1,200 classified documents, including cables, memos, briefings, and policy papers. The materials covered U.S. positions on arms control, assessments of Soviet leadership, contingency plans for Berlin and Cuba, and internal debates about diplomatic strategy. The KGB had used the information to anticipate American negotiating tactics, identify vulnerabilities in U.S. policy, and refine their own strategic calculations. In at least 3 instances, the intelligence Peterson provided had directly influenced Soviet decision-making during critical moments. The 1961 Berlin crisis, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and the 1963 Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty negotiations. The CIA's analysts concluded that her espionage had materially degraded U.S. negotiating effectiveness and provided the Soviet Union with strategic advantages that persisted for years. The assessment was classified top secret and remained so until partial declassification in 2004. What the damage assessment could not quantify was the psychological impact on the State Department's security culture. Peterson's case shattered the assumption that loyalty could be predicted by background checks and financial audits. She had no debts, no ideology, no coercion. She spied because she felt invisible and wanted to be seen. This realization forced a fundamental rethinking of counterintelligence priorities. The State Department implemented new protocols, mandatory psychological evaluations for all employees with top-secret clearances, random audits of document access, restrictions on solo work with classified materials, and increased scrutiny of employees who exhibited social isolation. The changes were codified in a classified directive known as the Peterson Protocol, which remained in effect until the end of the Cold War. But the deeper lesson, that espionage could be motivated by emotional need rather than material gain, was harder to operationalize. How do you screen for loneliness? How do you detect the quiet desperation of someone who feels unimportant? The Peterson case suggested that the most dangerous vulnerabilities were not the ones that appeared in security files, but the ones that lived in the human heart. The Soviet side of the story remained murky for decades. KGB files related to Peterson's case were not among the materials released after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and her handler, whether Kulikov or his successor, was never publicly identified. But in 1992, a former KGB officer named Oleg Kalugin, who had served in the first Chief Directorate during the 1960s, mentioned Peterson in his memoir. He did not use her name, referring to her only as the secretary, but the details matched. According to Kalugin, Peterson was considered one of the most valuable American assets of the early 1960s, not because she provided military secrets, but because she provided context that allowed Soviet analysts to understand American thinking. She gave us the ability to read between the lines, Kalugin wrote. We knew what the Americans were planning because we knew how they thought. He also noted that her arrest had been a significant loss and that the KGB had attempted, unsuccessfully, to recruit a replacement within the Moscow embassy. The operation, he said, had been considered too risky after Peterson's exposure. The Americans had learned their lesson, But had they? In the years following Peterson's conviction, the U.S. government faced a series of high-profile espionage cases that revealed similar vulnerabilities. John Walker, a Navy warrant officer who spied for money; Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who spied for greed and ego; Robert Hansen, an FBI agent who spied for reasons he never fully explained. Each case prompted new security measures, new training programs, new technologies. Yet the fundamental problem remained. Espionage is a human act, and human motivations are infinitely variable. Peterson spied because she felt unseen. Walker spied because he wanted wealth. Ames spied because he felt undervalued. Hansen spied because he craved control. No security system, no matter how sophisticated, can eliminate the human need for significance. The best it can do is detect the symptoms before the damage becomes catastrophic. In Peterson's case, the symptoms were detected. Ria's observations, the audit flag, the surveillance. But the system moved too slowly to prevent 5 years of sustained espionage. The question that haunted the investigators was not whether they could have caught her sooner, but whether they could have prevented her recruitment in the first place. The answer, almost certainly, is no. Peterson's recruitment was not the result of a security failure, but a human failure. A failure of connection, of recognition, of belonging. She worked in an embassy where everyone was busy, where the mission took precedence over the individual, where a competent secretary could go years without anyone asking how she was really doing. The KGB did not exploit a weakness in her clearance or her finances. They exploited a weakness in her soul, and they did it with patience, empathy, and precision. This is the enduring lesson of the Peterson case, that the most effective espionage is not about stealing secrets, but about filling voids. The Soviets understood this. They trained their handlers to identify not just access, but need. They built relationships before they made requests. They offered what the target's own institution did not: attention, validation, purpose. Peterson did not betray her country for ideology or money. She betrayed it because someone made her feel like she mattered. And in the transactional logic of espionage, that was enough. The broader implications of Peterson's case extended beyond counterintelligence into the realm of institutional psychology. The State Department, like most large bureaucracies, operated on the assumption that employees were motivated by career advancement, professional pride, and loyalty to mission. It did not account for the possibility that some employees might be motivated by the absence of those things, by the feeling that their work was invisible, their contributions unrecognized, their presence irrelevant. Peterson was competent, reliable, and unremarkable. She did her job well enough to avoid scrutiny, but not well enough to earn praise. She existed in a bureaucratic no-man's land where she was neither valued nor suspected, neither promoted nor fired. She was, in the language of organizational behavior, disengaged. And disengagement, the Peterson case revealed, was a security risk. An engaged employee has something to lose. A disengaged employee has nothing to protect. The KGB understood this. The State Department did not. In the decades since Peterson's arrest, the U.S. intelligence community has invested heavily in insider threat programs designed to detect employees who might be vulnerable to recruitment or coercion. These programs use behavioral analytics, psychological profiling, and peer reporting to identify warning signs: financial stress, personal crises, ideological radicalization, unexplained affluence, social withdrawal. But the Peterson case suggests that the most dangerous insiders are not the ones who exhibit obvious warning signs. but the ones who exhibit no signs at all. She was not in financial distress. She was not ideologically extreme. She did not withdraw from social contact because she had never been socially connected. She was invisible before she became a spy, and she remained invisible until the evidence became undeniable. The challenge for counterintelligence, then, is not just to detect anomalies, but to detect absences. To notice the people who are present but not seen, who contribute but are not acknowledged, who belong but do not connect. It is a challenge that no algorithm can fully solve because it requires something that bureaucracies struggle to provide: human attention. The question of what remains unknown about the Peterson case is substantial. The full extent of the documents she provided has never been publicly disclosed, and the CIA's damage assessment remains partially classified. The identity of her handler, or handlers, if there were multiple over 5 years, has never been confirmed. The KGB's internal evaluation of her intelligence value, if it still exists in Russian archives, has not been released, and Peterson herself, who lived for 28 years after her release from prison, never gave a public interview or wrote a memoir. She took her full story to the grave. What we are left with is a fragmentary record. Court transcripts, declassified memos, second-hand accounts from defectors and investigators. These fragments allow us to reconstruct the mechanics of her espionage, the meetings, the dead drops, the documents, but they do not fully explain the psychology. Why did she continue for 5 years? Did she ever consider stopping? Did she believe she was helping the Soviet Union? Or was the ideology irrelevant? Did she feel guilt, or only fear of being caught? The answers to these questions died with her. What we do know is that Martha Peterson's espionage was not an aberration, but a case study in a particular kind of vulnerability that persists in any large institution: the vulnerability of the overlooked. She was not a disgruntled employee or a radical. She was a competent professional who felt invisible and found someone who made her feel seen. The fact that the person who saw her was a KGB officer and the cost of being seen was 23 years in prison is a tragedy of individual choice and institutional neglect. The State Department could have prevented her recruitment by fostering a culture of recognition and connection. The KGB succeeded because they provided what her employer did not. This is not to excuse her betrayal or to minimize the damage she caused. It is to understand that espionage, at its core, is a transaction. The exchange of secrets for something the spy values more than loyalty. For Peterson, that something was significance, and she paid for it with her freedom, her reputation, and the rest of her life. The legacy of the Peterson case is visible in the security protocols that govern U.S. embassies today. Document access is tightly controlled, with multiple sign-offs required for classified materials. Employees are subject to random audits and continuous evaluation. Psychological wellness programs are mandatory. Peer reporting is encouraged. The assumption of trust has been replaced by a culture of verification. These measures have undoubtedly prevented some cases of espionage, but they have also created a work environment defined by suspicion and surveillance. The cost of security is intimacy. The cost of preventing another Martha Peterson is a workplace where no one is invisible because everyone is watched. Whether this trade-off is worth it is a question each institution must answer for itself. But the Peterson case makes clear that the alternative, a culture of benign neglect where competent employees can go years without meaningful recognition, carries its own risks. And those risks, as the Cold War demonstrated again and again, can be catastrophic. In the end, Martha Peterson's story is not just about espionage. It is about what happens when institutions treat people as functionaries rather than individuals, when competence is assumed rather than acknowledged, when presence is mistaken for connection. She was a woman who wanted to matter, and the only people who made her feel like she did were the ones who were using her. That is the tragedy. That is the lesson. And that is why, more than 60 years after her arrest, her case remains a cautionary tale for anyone responsible for managing people in high-stakes environments. The most dangerous threat is not always the one you can see. Sometimes it is the one you have stopped looking at. Sometimes it is the person who has been there all along, doing their job, waiting to be noticed. And sometimes, by the time you notice, it is already too late.